I personally did not start therapy until pandemic started, actually.
I was like 16 years old. I went to therapy in college.
I have no therapy experience.
I didn't previously go to therapy.
I grew up in Mississippi and everything was like church, prayed away, Jesus will handle it.
When I was in the Army, I had like those support groups. We talked about like our deployment and then how we were mentally and adjustments from coming from the combat zone to regular real world life.
The first time I went to therapy in college, it was more about dealing with burnout. I went to PWI that was very, very intense. And I was trying really, really hard to be a doctor and work a full-time job and run multiple student organizations. And I was running myself into the ground. I went to like a family therapist and he was a very unkind man. His therapy approach was just to scream at me and make me feel like I was causing all the problems with the family. And so it got to a point where I told my parents, I was like, I will just do whatever it is you want for me to like qualify as a good kid if it means I can stop going to therapy.
I did family therapy with my children after a traumatic experience, and then myself, I went to a different therapist after an abusive relationship, actually.
It was actually a previous partner of mine that recommended it. She noticed habits of not being as emotionally available or emotionally open. As a black man, I really inherited the whole stereotype of like angry black man, so I tried to be the opposite of that, which is like numb black man who feels nothing, which is just as toxic on the other end.
I've always associated therapy with like horrible, traumatic situations. I finally came to the understanding that trauma is not just somebody dying and things like that, where it's like there are so many situations that we invalidate for ourselves how it affects us, and having somebody really just validate how past situations have affected who I am today is just really, really helpful.
We'll go to the 50 and it'll give us a wider field of view.
Yeah, when both gonna be working on you.
It's called acting, babe.
So there's two pieces when you think about trauma. One, there's exposure to some event that is both, unexpected and troubling, and usually invokes some form of fear or anxiety. And that exposure alone is an experience of trauma.
It's something that surpasses their ability to cope in the moment. It's usually something that makes them feel unsafe, or where they are witnessing someone else in a very unsafe situation.
The second piece is to have a reaction to that event. Some people react to exposure to trauma with freezing. Some people engage in fight or flight. Some people react by kind of going into a shell and becoming more avoidant.
When a little bit of time passes, those of us that have good social support networks and a lot of resources, both internal and external, many times can recover on our own. But for a good percentage of folks, especially those with limited resources or with limited social support systems, or people that have endured one trauma after another, absolutely do need professional support.
Something that stands out to me and Jade is perhaps not the scene that everybody might think about when a white student walks by her, grabs her hair, and says, "It's so pretty," and walks out kind of holding her books really politely and cute. And nobody would ever do that to a white person with any other kind of hair. Although the person is intending to be complimentary and trying to make a bid for affection, she is actually pointing out that her hair is different. That one thing might not seem that big of a deal, but when we look at that as a quick snapshot in Jade's life, and these happen to her every day, all the time, and what we're seeing is the accumulation of her at 17-ish years old reacting to what has been going on her whole life, and that's what she's thinking throughout the film. And so I think it's important for people to recognize that these, what can be perceived as minor experiences, accumulate on top of each other. And it is not just about that single thing, and it might not be about that one person that did that one thing, but the holistic lived experience.
When we talk about race and when we talk specifically about Black people, a lot of the behaviors that are observed are miscoined as aggressive or criminal or delinquent when actually they're grounded in real lived experiences of trauma. The trauma that our young people experience doesn't always present as, "Oh, I need help." We know that the symptoms of trauma include hypervigilance, hyperarousal. So that means that head on a swivel, I'm constantly looking, I'm constantly monitoring my surroundings to check for safety. to someone who doesn't understand trauma, neither do they understand the Black experience, then that already is provoking a fear. And for psychologists and for social workers, then that only becomes further grounds for their ailment or for their pathology.
When Judy Herman wrote the book Trauma and Recovery about what she called at the time complex PTSD, was really about trauma occurring in systems that were also responsible for the person's survival or their caregiving systems. And now when we talk about complex trauma, we ought to be also including all the other layers of complexity in people's lives. And that includes all of the ways that our systems are built to harm certain people because of who they are.
Shift from here to the couch when you say serves her right.
Okay.
I am going to wherever these are located and getting me some. Growing up in an environment where, as a Black man, your Black friends, your Black people, like, not everybody gets a chance to make it to 25, and like how when you are blessed enough to make that feeling that arises, why me? Why did I make it? And my therapist was able to pinpoint that feeling before I could be labeled as survivor's guilt and the racial lens and pressure that puts on you to just make it. They really understood how race in this country can play and add stress and trauma on you in ways that you may not even recognize.
When I found a couples counselor, I was insistent that we find a person of color, particularly a woman of color, and we ended up with a Black female therapist, and it has been monumental because it's not just about what I do in my regular life, but I'm married to a white dude, and race comes up. Race is an issue in our lives. Certainly, it's been so helpful to have a woman of color who can speak to racial trauma and understand my POV and help translate it.
I would say the therapist that I'm working with definitely works from a trauma-informed lens. I was a little bit nervous at first because she is a white woman who I believed would not understand a lot of the problems that I was having. I didn't realize how much she did understand how I'm not wrong for associating certain conflicts with racial or gender things that I identify with.
I actually went to a group therapy session. We talked about things that we don't consider trauma, and race was a big part of it. Experiencing problematic issues day to day, or some of the things that we've even seen in the last year or two so vividly, people not realizing that they were holding that weight, and how even just seeing something is experiencing trauma. In
2020 and 2021, there's been this real rise in anti-Asian xenophobia because of COVID, and I'm glad people are paying attention to it now, but it's not like I wasn't called slurs all the time growing up. It's not like as a queer person, I also don't have slurs about that, or have had things thrown at me, or violence in other ways. We continue to seek the right care and the right help and the right person to work with us.
Reading the script for Jade really, it made me like tear up when I first read it, because it's like I think about so many situations in like whether it's when you're like in your more formative years when you're younger and like don't really understand that a lot of issues, whether it's just kind of like somebody not taking you seriously in a lot of ways, or making slightly racial jokes at your expense, and you're expected to kind of laugh about it, or like constantly expected to be the bigger person. I didn't realize how exhausting that would be and how much that affects me as an adult, of being expected to accept that type of like disrespect for your whole life because you don't want to lash out or like look like you're difficult, or like you're being over dramatic. Really what a lot of us needed as younger teenagers or kids or whatever was just a validation from adults.
Your skin is, wow. Yes.
Thank you. I try.
Good exposure.
Quiet on set, let's roll sound, we're rolling. Action.
In high school, we had one-on-one sessions with like a therapist, I guess. I feel like it helped me kind of realize the things I needed to work on myself and kind of like what I was feeling in the moment. And honestly, without it, I don't know where I would be. So I have immigrant parents, and they kind of think like your life is in your life and it's their life and they can control it. So it was like a lot of conflict in that point, and it started to like, because we were arguing so much, I thought I was the problem. But then after like talking to my therapist, she says, no, those are valid emotions, because at the end of the day, like, it is your life. And just kind of like seeing that I'm not the crazy one.
In high school, I was the only Black one in my musical theater class my senior year. So of course I was gonna get looks and things. And also, like, I had been studying music and things like that. There was one instance where I had to play an instrument in a show, and there was a white person conducting me, and I was playing the right time signature, but they were playing the wrong one, and they just kind of assumed that I didn't know anything, like, at all.
95% of the time, I would be the only Black student like in the classroom. And so it was kind of hard, because then when we talk about like racial issues, it's like they're very indifferent towards it, or like they're part of the problem. So kind of having a space to like process through that emotion and kind of learn more about my like history as like being African in an American country, it was something that was very useful. And like my therapist was also Black, so it was like she kind of understood what I was going through.
I just think about this all the time, like, you know, when like a Black person gets shot or something happens, like anything happens to them, we all feel it. George Floyd could have been my cousin. Like we all feel that same pain and all trauma like together.
During the film, I just gasped, because what she experienced, like, you know, it's so similar to like experience that I have, or like my friends have had. So like, for example, when talking about the dress code, because we had an issue with that at our school, when she said that her and another girl who was skinnier wore the same thing, but then she got sent to the office for it. That is exactly things that they do, where they try to like sexualize like Black women body, especially curvy ones, to, you know, be something that it's not.
I feel like Jade was me. I've heard these things before. I did have a teacher in high school. She was white. Her name was Addie Barnhart, and she was really like the ear for all the Black kids there. Like, she really understood us. She would sit there and just listen. She was just like, let us talk to her, and she would like console us and like really got us through the day.
I think it's really, really imperative for therapists and mental health practitioners who are in the spaces where they're getting to work with these specific young populations, that they be especially aware of how to be culturally competent, because that's your first experience with therapy for a lot of them. And if you give them a bad experience, one, not only will it maybe exacerbate the harm they're currently experiencing, but then they may never want to have therapy again.
In addition to representation, we want to have therapists and clinicians who really understand the history of their clients, who really understand the ways in which their clients are treated in a society that's structured to uplift whiteness.
Most of our systems are set up like a retail model, right? Like, we have a product, and then people are going to come who want it. The idea that we're going to only provide this support to people who come and ask for it, by definition means the people who most need it aren't going to get it. We have to figure out, how do we engage people? How do we prove our trustworthiness?
Most of the youth that I worked with went to 2 different Chicago public schools. And I used that time just to check in, see how they were doing, maybe check in on school attendance. You know, of course, my kids knew typically the days that I would come in. I got to know staff. And I clearly remembered one day going into one of these schools, and I had developed a pretty close relationship with, I believe he was a dean of students or something like that. And I walked into the office and was horrified to see that all of the kids I was coming to see had been called down already, because he knew I was coming, but they were lined up in the office sitting on the radiator. And it was this horrible moment where I just had realized I had now outed them as being kids who were on probation. And also had the realization, I never even asked them, are you okay with me coming to see you at school? You know, there's a need to be compassionate and to really allow them space to feel safe, to feel, to be able to be vulnerable, to be able to be open, but also understanding it may take them a while, especially with the system like ours, to open up. And we just should not assume that they're just going to automatically open up and share all of these horrible things that happen in their lives. And hear from them what it is that they need.
I find that as a white provider, I really have to check myself because I'm walking around with this intent to become more aware, right? And to understand that my role as a white person in this privileged society prevent me from having experiences, I'm very fortunate in that way, right, of racism or discrimination based on color. And so I've found through trial and error that I have to open the door and have to ask questions about people's experience with that, but I also can't make assumptions.
Another lens that I love to use in my practice comes from Black feminists and Black activists, specifically Black women, which is intersectionality. How are Black women uniquely impacted by all different forms of oppression, right? So specifically, how are they impacted by racism? How are they also impacted by sexism? But also, how are they impacted by gendered racism, which is a unique form of oppression that Black women experience? So I use that lens to kind of think about my clients and think about who they are, what's their identity, and then how those identities are weaponized, right? How those identities are dehumanized in society. And then I try to create space in our work together for them to name and for them to discuss and process.
I think as a white person in our society, you have to find ways to signal to people that you're not a supporter of white supremacy. I mean, even the way I look, I get mistaken for the police by kids that I'm talking to in the hospital. The ways that we carry ourselves and the ways that we communicate with people, the language we use, all of that, we can signal to people that we care about them, that we support them, or that we understand some of what they're dealing with. Even bringing up your own race can be a very effective way of opening it up topic. I mean, in the film that happens. Someone could say, well, I'm not Black, so I couldn't do that. Well, but no, that's why you ought to do it.
I would love for young people to know that we out here. I would love for young people to know that if you're looking for a Black, dope, or queer, or person of color, therapist, or healer, we out here. Speak up. I also really want young people to know, even though it might seem antithetical, that individual one-on-one therapy is just simply not the way or the only way for you to heal.
It is often the most recognized tool and sometimes a very accessible tool for some folks and a very inaccessible tool for others. So I really encourage people figuring out how they can find healing on their own as well.
Somebody asked me a long time ago, like, why do you think that there aren't enough Black therapists? And I was like, what do you mean? What do you mean? There's plenty of us. In fact, there's many Black therapists who don't call themselves therapists. There's many Black therapists who are not licensed or regulated by our governing boards. And so there are many healers. And so for young people who are hurting, I think my biggest point for you would be to just connect. Speak to someone, if it's a friend, if it's a sibling group, if it's at the dinner table, the people on the bus on the way to school.
It's so important that we acknowledge these things as soon as they're happening, not 20 years later, not 30 years later, in the moment while it's happening. So that was what was so exciting to me about Jade, that we had the opportunity to tell a story about a young woman who is experiencing multiple forms of trauma, and we have an opportunity to say, this is valid, it's real, and it operates on us, and here are ways that we can take control and help ourselves and get help from the people who are meant to be helping us.
Probably the primary thing that I would want youth of color presenting to therapy to know is that oppression, discrimination, feeling marginalized by any aspect of your identity, including your race, is something that can result in extreme stress for you, for your family, for your community. It can also be traumatizing.
I know a lot of trauma and the pain we go through in life can be scary, but if you can get a chance to reflect on and learn from that pain, it can be a great tool to get you through life. that pain can turn to protection.
Part of the intersection between race and trauma is that the problem is not inside of us. The problem is not inside of the client. The problem is in society. And if we're able to help people internalize that and resist self-blame for the oppression they experience, now that is healing.